Now, Iraq's once mighty rivers are under growing strain as climate change.
The footage came from 3 different sources: military satellites, weather monitoring stations, and a civilian drone that was in the wrong place at the right time. All 3 captured the same impossible sight. At coordinates that governments won't release, the Euphrates has dropped 60 feet in 72 hours. Not from drought, not from dam operations. The water is being pulled down into something below the riverbed, something that's creating a perfect spiral formation on the surface. But here's what they don't want you to know. The structure that's been exposed isn't just ancient. It's geometrically perfect. 6 sides, smooth stone, with an opening at the center that descends straight down into darkness. And carved around that opening are symbols that appear in exactly 3 places on Earth: the Euphrates River, the Temple Mount, and Area 51. The connection is undeniable. But what's inside that structure is about to rewrite everything we thought we understood about. The first team went down at dawn, professional cave explorers hired by a private research group that won't reveal their funding source. Their body cameras captured what happened next. 40 feet below ground level, the stone walls are covered in markings, not random scratches, deliberate writing. 3 different languages carved into the same surface: Ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and a third script that linguistic experts can't identify. But they can translate enough to know this isn't a tomb, it's a warning. Sealed until the appointed time, bound by divine command. When the waters fall, the watchers rise. The explorers found more than writing. At the 60-foot mark, their cameras captured metal objects embedded in the stone. Chains, massive iron links, each the size of a man's torso. The metal shows no rust, despite being underground for millennia, as if something preserved it, protected it, kept it strong for a purpose. But the chains aren't the most disturbing discovery. It's what the chains are attached to. 4 anchor points, carved deep into the bedrock. Empty anchor points. Whatever was bound here broke free recently. Very recently. The stone around each anchor shows fresh fracture marks. And that's when the team's equipment started malfunctioning. Their lights flickered. Their cameras captured shadows, moving where no one was standing. And from somewhere deeper in the structure came a sound that forced them to evacuate immediately. The sound of something breathing, something large, something that had been waiting. The breathing wasn't human. The team leader's audio equipment captured 17 minutes of rhythmic inhalation, deep, deliberate, coming from multiple directions at once, as if the structure itself was alive. Then came the voices, not speaking, humming, a low harmonic frequency that made the explorers' chest cavities vibrate. The sound engineer who analyzed the recordings later said it matched no known language, but it carried patterns, mathematical sequences, as if something was counting down. The team's thermal cameras detected massive heat signatures moving through chambers they hadn't reached yet, signatures showing forms over 12 feet tall, moving in synchronized patterns, not wandering, patrolling. At the 78-foot mark, they found the first physical evidence: footprints in stone, not carved, pressed, as if something with immense weight had walked across solid rock and left permanent impressions. The prints measured 18 inches long, with claw marks extending beyond the toes. But the discovery that ended their expedition happened when they reached the central chamber. Their lights illuminated 4 massive stone platforms, each one showing clear signs of recent occupancy. Depressions where enormous forms had laid for centuries. But the platforms were empty, warm to the touch, and still radiating heat signatures. Whatever had been bound here was gone. The team's final transmission, before their equipment died, completely captured something that intelligence agencies are still analyzing: a shadow moving across the chamber ceiling, too large to be cast by any team member, moving independently. And when enhanced, the shadow shows wings. Wings spanning nearly 30 feet across. That's when they ran. But something followed them to the surface. The team never made it back to their vehicles. Security footage from a gas station 12 miles away captured what happened next. 4 figures stumbling across the parking lot at 3 a.m., moving in perfect synchronization. Not walking, gliding, their feet never quite touching the ground. But these weren't the explorers. The figures stood nearly 8 feet tall, wearing the explorers' clothing, but the proportions were wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too broad. And when the security camera zoomed in on their faces, the features were human, but the eyes reflected light like an animal's. The real explorers were found 6 hours later, alive but changed. All 4 men speaking in unison, describing visions of a great gathering, 4 ancient beings awakening others of their kind across the world, and a countdown that had already begun. Medical examinations revealed something impossible. Each man's DNA had been altered. Specific genetic markers were enhanced. Strength increased by 400%. Reflexes accelerated beyond human capacity. But most disturbing was the brain scan results. New neural pathways had formed overnight. Pathways that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. The men kept repeating the same phrase in ancient Aramaic. "The bound ones walk among you now." Within 48 hours, similar incidents were reported in 17 countries, always near ancient sites, always involving teams that had been investigating underground discoveries, and always resulting in the same outcome: people going missing, and something else taking their place. Government agencies began connecting the dots. Every incident traced back to locations mentioned in a specific biblical text. Revelation. Chapter 9. The passage about 4 angels bound at the great river Euphrates. But the angels weren't angels at all. They were something much older, something that predated human civilization by millennia. And they had been waiting for this exact moment in history, too. The classified documents were leaked by a Vatican insider who refused to give his name. Ancient manuscripts that the Church had kept sealed for over 800 years. Texts that revealed the truth about what was really bound beneath the Euphrates. They weren't fallen angels, they were the Nephilim, the offspring of angels and human women mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, but not the giants that died in the flood. These were the first generation, the original 4, the ones so powerful that God himself had to intervene and chain them beneath the earth. The manuscripts describe them as the Watchers of the Deep, beings who possessed knowledge that humanity wasn't meant to have, technology that built the impossible structures of ancient civilizations, pyramids, Stonehenge, structures that modern engineering still can't explain. But their real purpose wasn't construction, it was preparation. Archaeological evidence supports the manuscripts. Every major ancient civilization has stories about 4 powerful beings who came from beneath the earth. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Egyptians knew them as the 4 sons of Horus. The Mayans recorded them as the Bacabs, who held up the corners of the world. All cultures describe the same event. The 4 beings would return during the final age of mankind, not to destroy the world, but to prepare it for something else to arrive. The leaked documents reveal government knowledge of this timeline. Project Euphrates has been monitoring the river since 1952, waiting for the water levels to drop, waiting for the seals to break, and preparing for what intelligence agencies call the gathering. Because the 4 beings bound at the Euphrates were just the beginning. Ancient texts describe 200 others scattered across the globe, all waiting for their leaders to call them home. That call went out 2 hours ago, and satellite imagery shows they're responding. The satellite feeds came from NOAA, European Space Agency, and 3 classified military sources, all showing the same phenomenon occurring simultaneously across 6 continents. Ground movement at Giza, seismic activity beneath Stonehenge, unexplained heat signatures rising from Machu Picchu, ancient sites that have been dormant for thousands of years, suddenly showing massive energy readings, all within a 1-2 hour window following the Euphrates incident. But the most disturbing evidence came from thermal imaging satellites. At each location, the same pattern emerged. underground chambers heating up rapidly, massive forms moving through subterranean passages. And then, emergence. The footage from Easter Island shows 4 figures breaking through solid rock as if it were sand, each one over 10 feet tall, moving with purpose toward the coastline. Satellite tracking followed them for 6 miles before they disappeared into the Pacific Ocean, swimming at speeds that defied physics. Similar emergences were documented at 23 locations worldwide, always in groups of 4 or more, always heading toward major population centers, and always leaving behind the same calling card. Ancient symbols carved into the earth, symbols that form a pattern when viewed from above. The pattern is a map, convergence points where the awakened beings are gathering. The largest convergence point sits directly over Jerusalem. But there's a second location that has intelligence agencies in complete panic: Washington, D.C. Military satellites captured thermal signatures of over 40 beings moving through underground tunnel systems beneath the Capitol, systems that don't appear on any government blueprint, as if these tunnels were built long before the city existed. The beings aren't hiding, they're organizing, and according to intercepted communications between world leaders, they've begun making contact with human governments. But they're not negotiating, they're issuing ultimatums. The encrypted communications were intercepted by amateur radio operators who didn't understand what they were hearing. Conversations between world leaders, speaking in hushed, panicked tones. References to the Covenant and the original agreement. The ultimatums weren't delivered through normal diplomatic channels. They came through direct mental contact with heads of state during closed-door sessions. No witnesses, no recordings. Just world leaders emerging from private meetings with the same haunted expression and identical message: humanity has 30 days to prepare. The demands are simple, but impossible. All governments must acknowledge the beings as humanity's original creators. Historical records must be rewritten to reflect the true origin of human civilization. And most shocking of all, a specific percentage of the global population must be prepared for transition. The transition isn't explained in detail, but leaked medical reports suggest it involves the same DNA alterations found in the Euphrates exploration team, enhancing human capabilities to serve a purpose that governments are forbidden from revealing. President Biden's chief of staff was overheard telling security personnel that compliance isn't optional. The European Union held an emergency session lasting 18 hours. No official statement was released, but flight logs show every EU leader immediately flew to undisclosed locations. China's response was more direct. Satellite imagery shows massive construction projects beginning at 12 locations across the country, structures that match architectural patterns found at ancient sites, as if they're building according to specifications provided by the awakened beings. But 3 world leaders refused the ultimatum completely. Their responses were broadcast simultaneously across every electronic device on Earth for exactly 90 seconds before all signals cut out. The leaders haven't been seen since, and their countries are reporting massive seismic activity beneath major cities. The 3 nations that refused were Brazil, Australia, and Norway. Their defiance lasted exactly 48 hours. Brazil was first. At 3:17 a.m. local time, every major city experienced simultaneous 8.5 magnitude earthquakes. But these weren't natural quakes. Seismologists recorded impossible patterns. The tremors formed geometric shapes when mapped, perfect circles radiating outward from ancient sites that predated known Brazilian civilizations. Underground, something was carving tunnels, massive boreholes appearing beneath Sao Paulo, Rio, and Brasilia, creating a network that connected all 3 cities in a triangle formation. Thermal imaging showed the tunnels weren't empty. They were filled with moving heat signatures, hundreds of them. Australia's punishment was more visible. The entire continent experienced what meteorologists called impossible weather. Massive lightning storms with no clouds. Tornadoes spinning in perfect spirals for hours without dissipating. And in the center of each weather anomaly, witnesses reported seeing figures walking through the chaos unaffected. But Norway's fate was the most terrifying. The entire population of Oslo reported the same dream on the same night, a vision of 4 towering beings standing in the city center, speaking in unison, delivering a message in ancient Norwegian that translated to, "Your leaders chose poorly." When citizens woke up, 200,000 people had vanished overnight. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty homes with doors still locked from the inside. Surveillance footage showed the missing people walking calmly into the streets at exactly midnight. Then the cameras went black. Within 72 hours, all 3 governments issued public apologies, official statements accepting new archaeological evidence about human origins, and announcing their participation in global transition protocols. The message was clear: compliance wasn't negotiable. But for the nations that cooperated early, something different was happening. The compliant nations thought they had chosen wisely. Initial reports seemed to confirm this. Economic prosperity skyrocketed overnight. Technological breakthroughs appeared in every sector. Medical advances that should have taken decades were implemented within days. But the source of these improvements was troubling. Citizens in cooperative countries began reporting enhanced abilities, increased strength, perfect memory recall, the ability to solve complex mathematical problems without training. At first, it seemed like humanity was evolving, but medical examinations revealed the truth. The DNA modifications weren't voluntary. Atmospheric analysis detected microscopic particles in the air supply of major cities, particles that didn't exist in nature. When inhaled, they attached to human chromosomes and began rewriting genetic code. The process was painless, undetectable, and irreversible. Within 2 weeks, 60% of the population in compliant nations had been biologically altered. Brain scans showed new neural pathways forming connections to regions that control obedience and group thinking. Individual personality traits were being systematically erased and replaced with collective consciousness patterns. The beings weren't liberating humanity, they were preparing it for harvest. Intelligence reports from inside cooperative governments revealed the true timeline. The 30-day ultimatum was never about negotiation. It was about identifying which populations would submit willingly and which would require force. The compliant nations were being used as testing grounds for mass consciousness transfer. But the most chilling discovery came from intercepted communications between the awakened beings themselves. They weren't speaking to each other in ancient languages. They were speaking in a dialect that linguists recognized. The same language recorded in alien abduction cases dating back 70 years. The beings bound at the Euphrates weren't ancient guardians of Earth. They were advance scouts, and their awakening was sending a signal across space to something much larger. Radio telescopes around the world detected it simultaneously, a signal broadcasting from Earth into deep space, not from any human transmission facility. The source was triangulated to the exact coordinates where the 4 beings first emerged from the Euphrates. The signal wasn't random electromagnetic noise. It was structured, mathematical, and it was repeating the same sequence every 4.7 minutes. When decoded, the message contained 2 elements that sent astrophysicists into crisis mode: Earth's exact galactic coordinates and a countdown. But the signal wasn't just being sent outward. Something was responding. The Arecibo Observatory's final transmission before it went dark captured an incoming reply, a massive electromagnetic pulse traveling toward our solar system at impossible speeds. Based on trajectory calculations, the source originated from a region of space that NASA has been monitoring in complete secrecy since 1977. The same region where the WOW signal was detected, the signal that scientists claimed was the first potential proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. But classified documents revealed the truth. The WOW signal wasn't the first contact, it was a warning, a message telling humanity that the Watchers were still sleeping, and Earth was protected as long as they remained bound. Now the Watchers are awake, the signal has been sent, and something vast is responding from the depths of space. Deep space network facilities are tracking multiple objects entering the outer solar system. Objects the size of small moons, moving in perfect formation. Their trajectory is precise, direct, and their estimated arrival time matches the countdown being broadcast from Earth. 7 days. The beings at the Euphrates weren't preparing humanity for evolution. They were preparing it for collection, and whatever is coming from space is bringing the technology to complete the harvest. The Hubble Space Telescope's final images before it was remotely disabled showed details that NASA immediately classified. The approaching objects weren't ships in any conventional sense. They were structures, massive geometric forms that defied physics, each one spanning hundreds of miles across. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't their size, it was their design. The structures matched architectural patterns found in ancient ruins worldwide: pyramids, ziggurats, stone circles, as if human civilizations had been building landing platforms for thousands of years. Earth's preparation accelerated dramatically. The awakened beings began appearing openly in major cities, no longer hiding, no longer disguising themselves as humans, walking through streets in their true forms while modified humans knelt in reverence. Military satellites captured construction, beginning at coordinates that form a perfect pentagram when mapped globally. Massive excavation sites appearing overnight, ancient foundations being uncovered and expanded. Platforms being built according to specifications that require mathematical knowledge beyond current human understanding. But the most chilling development was happening to the unmodified population. People who hadn't undergone DNA alteration were being gathered into specific zones, not camps, not prisons, holding areas with precise environmental controls, temperature, humidity, air composition, all maintained at levels optimal for what intelligence reports describe as biological preservation. The modified humans weren't being prepared for evolution. They were being prepared as ambassadors, translators between the incoming fleet and the preserved population. And the preserved population wasn't being saved. They were being prepared for transport. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the true purpose of the global construction. The platforms weren't landing sites. They were loading docks, designed to facilitate the rapid movement of large populations into the approaching structures. The countdown reached 72 hours, and that's when the first advance vessel became visible to the naked eye. At 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time, every screen on Earth displayed the same image simultaneously: a massive dark structure blocking out stars across the northern hemisphere. No government broadcast this. No satellite network transmitted it. The image simply appeared on every connected device worldwide. The advance vessel had arrived. Within minutes, reports flooded in from every continent. The structure was descending slowly toward the Middle East, directly above the Euphrates River. As it approached, the awakened beings across the globe began moving with synchronized purpose, all heading toward the same coordinates where this nightmare began. But something unexpected happened. The preserved populations weren't being loaded onto transport platforms. They were being released. Modified humans began removing the environmental controls, opening the containment zones, telling the unmodified to run. Intelligence agencies intercepted frantic communications between the awakened beings. Something in their language that translators rendered a protocol violation and early arrival. The vessel hadn't come according to plan. It had come in response to something else entirely. Deep space monitoring detected massive energy signatures approaching from the opposite direction, objects moving at light speed toward Earth. But these weren't part of the original fleet. The trajectories were wrong. The approach vectors suggested pursuit rather than coordination. The advance vessel began transmitting on all frequencies, a message in perfect English that chilled every person who heard it. The harvest is compromised. Initiate final protocol. Eliminate the witnesses. Prepare for. The transmission cut out abruptly. Emergency broadcast systems worldwide detected the same phenomenon. Every satellite in Earth's orbit had gone dark simultaneously. All deep space communications ceased. Even hardened military networks went offline. Looking up at the night sky, observers noticed something impossible. Stars were disappearing, not fading, vanishing instantly. as if something massive was moving through space, blocking them out one by one. And then, at exactly midnight GMT, every awakened being on Earth looked up at the same moment and screamed. The sound was heard across 6 continents, a wailing that shattered windows and sent animals fleeing in panic. But it wasn't a sound of triumph. It was a sound of terror. Something had arrived that even they feared. Something that had been hunting them across space for millennia, and it had finally found them. The last transmission, before all communications died, came from a single source, a radio operator in Antarctica, broadcasting on emergency frequency. This isn't first contact. This is Judgment Day. And we're not the ones being judged. They are. Whatever's coming next isn't here for us. It's here for...
It appeared at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, not gradually, not as a distant light growing larger over hours. It simply materialized in low Earth orbit the way a stone appears when floodwaters recede, as if it had always been there, waiting, hidden in a frequency of light that human eyes weren't designed to detect, until the beings from the Euphrates changed that. Reports flooded in from every continent simultaneously, hundreds of millions of people stepping outside their homes, looking up, drawn by an instinct they couldn't explain. A pull that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something buried deep in human DNA, something that had been dormant for millennia. The vessel was enormous. Early calculations put it at 847 miles across, perfectly circular, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it appear as a massive dark circle against the star field, a hole in the sky, edges perfectly defined, perfectly still, but it wasn't silent. Every radio receiver on Earth picked up the same transmission, not in ancient languages this time. In every modern human language simultaneously, as if the vessel's communication system had spent centuries monitoring Earth's linguistic evolution and catalogued every dialect, every tongue, every regional variation. The message was simple: we have returned for what was planted. 3 words that sent theologians, scientists, and intelligence analysts into immediate crisis, because the phrase appeared verbatim in documents that had never been publicly released. Ancient Sumerian tablets held in a private Vatican archive. Tablets that described the moment of human creation not as divine love but as agricultural necessity. Humanity wasn't created in God's image. Humanity was engineered as a crop. The classified files that intelligence agencies had been sitting on for decades suddenly made horrifying sense. The missing link in human evolution that scientists could never explain. The inexplicable leap from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens that happened too quickly for natural selection. The fact that human DNA contains sequences that have no evolutionary precedent. Sequences that look less like natural development and more like deliberate code insertion. The beings at the Euphrates hadn't been guarding humanity, they had been tending it, maintaining the crop, keeping the harvest conditions optimal until the farmers returned. And the farmers had returned. Military response was immediate and completely ineffective. Nuclear launch codes were entered at facilities across 3 continents. Every warhead misfired simultaneously, not disabled, not intercepted, simply inert. As if the explosive compounds had been chemically neutralized at a molecular level, as if something had been slowly removing their destructive capacity for years without anyone noticing. Conventional weapons fared no better. Fighter jets scrambled from bases worldwide, encountered navigation system failures within visual range of the vessel. Not crashes, gentle forced landings. The pilots reported their controls simply becoming unresponsive and guiding their aircraft safely to the ground as if something else had taken over the flight systems. The advance vessel wasn't threatened by humanity's defenses. It wasn't even inconvenienced by them. And then the smaller craft began descending. Not hundreds, thousands. Each one a perfect geometric shape. Tetrahedrons, octahedrons, icosahedrons. Every platonic solid represented. Moving in formations that created massive geometric patterns when viewed from above. Patterns that matched crop circle formations that had been appearing in fields worldwide for the past 50 years. Not coincidences. Not pranks. Not natural phenomena. Practice runs. Rehearsals for exactly this moment. The craft descended toward the construction sites that the awakened beings had been building, settling onto the platforms with mechanical precision, each one fitting its designated landing space as if the measurements had been taken in advance. Because they had been. Because the blueprints were ancient. Because this arrival had been planned before human civilization learned to write. And from each landed craft, figures emerged. Not the 12-foot beings from the Euphrates. Something different, smaller, closer to human proportions, but moving with an efficiency that no human body possessed. No wasted motion, no hesitation, pure mechanical purpose in biological form. They weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to make speeches. They weren't interested in cameras or world leaders or news broadcasts. They walked directly to the holding areas where the unmodified humans were being kept, began systematic processing with equipment that looked organic, grown rather than manufactured, pulsing with bioluminescent light that shifted color based on the individual being processed. And the processed individuals didn't resist, didn't scream, didn't fight. They smiled, and walked calmly toward the waiting craft, as if some part of them had always known this moment was coming, as if the fear and the resistance and the desperate clinging to human identity had been the aberration, and this surrender was the natural state. The harvest had begun, but not everyone surrendered. In 17 mountain locations across the globe, groups had been preparing, not governments, not military organizations, independent cells of individuals who had seen this coming, who had spent years studying the ancient texts not as mythology but as instruction manuals, not for worship, for warfare. They called themselves the Remnant. Their intelligence network had been operating in the shadows for decades, composed of former intelligence operatives, rogue archaeologists, disgraced scientists, and religious scholars who had been systematically removed from mainstream institutions for asking the wrong questions. People who had followed the evidence where it led and found themselves staring at a conclusion so enormous that sharing it publicly would have meant immediate discrediting. So they had prepared quietly, stockpiled resources in locations the beings wouldn't immediately think to look, developed communication systems that operated on frequencies outside the being's apparent monitoring range, and most importantly, they had discovered something in the ancient texts that the beings didn't know they knew, a frequency, a specific harmonic vibration that appeared in every ancient text describing the being's weakness. Different cultures, different languages, different centuries, but always the same mathematical frequency described in terms of sound. The Remnant had been building acoustic weapons for 11 years, not explosive, not chemical, pure focused sound waves calibrated to that specific frequency, devices that looked like nothing more sophisticated than large speaker arrays, but when activated at full power, they produced a harmonic resonance that the ancient texts described as the voice of the bound returning to bind the binders. The first test happened in the Andes Mountains of Peru. A group of 30 Remnant members set up their arrays on a ridge overlooking one of the construction platforms, waited until a group of the smaller visitors were processing humans at the site below, and activated the frequency at maximum output. The results were immediate and violent. Every being within a 2-mile radius stopped moving simultaneously. The processing equipment went dark, and the visitors collapsed to their knees with movements that looked involuntary, forced, as if their bodies were responding to the sound against their will. For 47 seconds, the harvest stopped. Then the advance vessel responded. A focused pulse from the orbital structure struck the ridge with precision that suggested the vessel had pinpointed the acoustic arrays in seconds. The pulse wasn't explosive, it was more like a conversation, a counter-frequency that neutralized the Remnant signal and left their equipment smoking and inert. But the 47 seconds had been enough to prove the concept. The frequency worked, the beings could be affected, could be stopped, even if temporarily, and the Remnant's global network immediately began sharing what they'd learned, modifying the frequency, amplifying it, finding ways to broadcast it through existing infrastructure, hijacking radio towers, reprogramming cellular networks, converting power grid transmission lines into massive antenna systems, turning the very technological infrastructure that the beings had left functional, perhaps deliberately, as a cage, into a weapon. Within 6 hours of the Peru test, Remnant cells in 43 countries activated simultaneously. The global frequency broadcast reached 73% of Earth's surface, and something remarkable happened. The modified humans stopped, the ones who had undergone DNA alteration, the ones whose neural pathways had been rewritten for obedience and collective consciousness. They stopped moving, stopped their processing assistance, and stood motionless for exactly 90 seconds. When they started moving again, something was different. Their eyes had changed. The flat, purposeful expression replaced by something more chaotic, more familiar, more human. Confusion, fear, and slowly, recognition. They were fighting their way back. The frequency wasn't just disrupting the visitors, it was interfering with the DNA modifications, creating feedback in the engineered neural pathways, giving the modified humans enough cognitive space to remember who they had been before the biological rewriting began. Not all of them could hold on to it. The modifications were deep, the rewriting was thorough, but enough of them regained sufficient independent consciousness to understand what was happening. And enough of them chose, in that brief window of clarity, to resist. Modified humans began interfering with processing operations from inside, subtle at first, misdirecting visitors, providing incorrect biological assessments, slowing the harvest rate by fractions that added up to hours when multiplied across global operations. The beings noticed immediately. The response was calculated and terrifying. Rather than trying to remodify the compromised individuals, the visitors simply removed them from operations, gathered the compromised modified humans into a separate category, and began accelerating the processing of the unmodified population at triple the previous rate. The remnant had bought time, but they had also shown their hand, and the advance vessel was adjusting its approach. New craft descended from the orbital structure. These ones were different, smaller, more agile, moving with speed that the previous arrivals hadn't demonstrated. They targeted remnant positions with accuracy that suggested the frequency broadcast had been traced before it was even fully established. 17 of 43 remnant cells were neutralized within 2 hours. Not destroyed, contained. The beings were collecting everyone, not selectively eliminating threats. But 6 cells had gone dark before the crackdown, disappeared into silence. Not captured, hidden, moving underground into tunnel systems that predated the beings' knowledge of human infrastructure. Ancient passages that the remnant had mapped over decades of archaeological research. Passages that led to a location that appeared nowhere in the beings' records of human civilization, because it had been built specifically to be forgotten. A facility constructed in secret over 40 years by the remnant's founders, buried beneath 300 feet of solid granite, powered by a geothermal system that produced no electromagnetic signature, housing technology developed in complete isolation from mainstream science. And at the center of that facility, a device that the remnant's founders had spent their entire lives building based on instructions found in the oldest written text ever discovered. Instructions they believed had been left by something that opposed the beings. Something that had been fighting this war across multiple civilizations, multiple harvest cycles. Something that was still fighting, and had been waiting for humanity to finally be ready to fight alongside it. The text was older than the Sumerian tablets. Older than any writing system currently acknowledged by mainstream archaeology. Found in 1962 by a geological survey team drilling in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. Buried under 400 feet of sediment that radiocarbon dating placed at over 50,000 years old. Written on a material that wasn't stone, wasn't metal, wasn't any organic compound that could be identified. A material that laboratory analysis described simply as unknown synthetic composite. Man-made. But 50,000 years before man learned to make anything. The Romanian government classified the discovery immediately. The survey team was debriefed under extreme secrecy protocols, and the artifact was placed in a facility that doesn't appear on any public government record. The remnant had gotten access to photographs of the text through a contact inside Romanian intelligence. Spent 20 years attempting translation, because the script wasn't related to any known ancient writing system. It was mathematical, deeply, fundamentally mathematical. Every symbol a function, every sentence an equation. When they finally cracked the translation framework, what they found changed everything. The text was a warning, but not the warning they expected. Not a warning about the beings returning. A warning about what had come before the beings. What the beings themselves feared. What had fought them across star systems and through multiple civilizations and had followed them here to Earth when humanity was first planted. The text called this opposition the inheritors of light. Beings of pure energy who had opposed the harvest civilization for longer than stellar formation. Who believed that the species being cultivated deserved the chance to evolve independently. To become something the farmers hadn't engineered them to become. The inheritors had been watching Earth, protecting it where they could. Subtle interventions that the beings couldn't directly counter without revealing their presence before the harvest was ready. The missing genetic sequences that should have made humans more compliant but somehow enhanced individual consciousness instead. The inexplicable moments throughout human history where civilizations should have collapsed but didn't. Where diseases should have been total extinctions but weren't. The inheritors had been running interference for 50,000 years. And the device at the center of the remnant's hidden facility had been built according to their specifications. Left in that ancient text as a gift, an apology for not being able to intervene more directly, and a tool for the moment when intervention became absolutely necessary. The device didn't look like a weapon. It looked like an antenna. A massive crystalline structure growing from a central processor that the remnant's engineers had spent 2 decades building to match the mathematical specifications exactly. Rising 40 feet through the center of the underground facility. Pulsing with an internal light that had no power source anyone could identify, as if the device itself was alive, as if it had been waiting. The 6 surviving remnant cells arrived at the facility within 18 hours of going dark, bringing with them the data from the Peru frequency test, the modified human recovery observations, and something more. 3 of the modified humans who had regained consciousness during the frequency broadcast had followed the remnant underground, fighting their own engineered impulses at every step. Choosing human identity over biological programming through sheer force of will. They brought information from inside the harvest operation, the timeline, the true scope of what was happening, and a detail that the remnant had missed in their frequency research. The beings weren't just collecting humans. They were looking for something specific among the population. A genetic marker, a sequence that appeared in roughly 0.003% of the human population. A sequence that the DNA modifications were designed to identify and isolate, not enhance. Isolate. Separate from the rest of the harvest population, because whatever that genetic sequence represented, the beings wanted it kept apart, kept pure, kept unmodified, kept, as the modified humans had overheard the visitors say in their own language, "For the higher purpose." The remnant's genetic specialist ran immediate analysis on everyone present in the facility. 847 individuals representing their 6 surviving cells, plus 3 recovered modified humans. 63 individuals carried the marker, just over 7% of those present, far higher than the global average. As if those who had been drawn to the remnant, who had spent their lives feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the official version of reality, who had sacrificed careers and relationships and safety to follow the truth wherever it led, were disproportionately represented in that 0.003%. As if the inheritors of light had been guiding the right people toward each other for decades. The ancient text had described what the marker meant, had explained what that genetic sequence represented in terms that the remnant's translators had initially dismissed as metaphorical. It wasn't metaphorical. The sequence was a bridge, a biological key designed by the inheritors and inserted into human DNA during one of their covert interventions 12,000 years ago, designed to activate under specific conditions. Conditions that were currently being met for the first time in human history. The device in the center of the facility recognized the marker, had been scanning for it since the remnant first powered it up 3 years ago, and with 63 carriers now present in its proximity, it began to respond. The crystalline structure brightened, the internal light shifting from white to a deep blue that seemed to exist slightly outside normal visible spectrum. The facility's instruments went haywire trying to measure the output, because what the device was producing wasn't electromagnetic, wasn't acoustic, wasn't any force that human physics had catalogued. It was something older than physics, something the inheritors had been using across star systems for longer than Earth's sun had existed, and the 63 marked individuals began to feel it, not through their senses, through something deeper, something that had been dormant in their DNA suddenly switching on like a light. They understood what they needed to do without being told, as if the knowledge had always been there, waiting for exactly this moment. They walked toward the device, placed their hands on its surface, and the facility filled with a light that had no source and cast no shadows. Above them, through 300 feet of solid granite, something noticed. The advance vessel felt it before any human instrument detected it. For the first time since entering Earth orbit, the massive structure changed its behavior. The thousands of small craft executing harvest operations paused simultaneously. For 3 full seconds, the global harvest stopped completely. Then the vessel oriented itself, slowly, deliberately, pointing its central axis toward a mountain range in Romania with a precision that suggested it knew exactly what was happening 300 feet below the granite. Inside the facility, the 63 marked individuals felt the device pulling something through them rather than from them, not taking their energy, using them as conduits, as biological antennas tuned to a frequency that the device alone couldn't produce but that human DNA carrying the inheritor sequence could generate when acting in concert. The remaining 784 individuals in the facility watched as the 63 began to change. Not dramatically, not physically. The change was in their presence, in the quality of the air around them, in the way light seemed to bend slightly toward them, in the sound their breathing made, synchronized perfectly without effort, creating that same harmonic resonance that the ancient text described. The device translated their combined biological output into something that the facility's instruments couldn't measure but that everyone present could feel in their chest, in their teeth, in the spaces behind their eyes. A signal, aimed upward, not into space, into a layer of reality adjacent to normal space, into the space between spaces where the inheritors of light had existed for longer than stellar formation. The remnant's founding texts had described what this signal was, a door being unlocked from the inside. The beings from the Euphrates felt it too. The 12-foot forms standing openly in city streets across the planet looked upward simultaneously. Their expressions, which had been unreadable, shifted. For the first time since emerging from beneath the earth, they showed something recognizable. Fear. Ancient fear. The kind of fear that existed before humanity had language to name it. The advance vessel fired another pulse toward the Romanian mountains, massively more powerful than the one that had neutralized the Peru acoustic array. Enough energy to level a city block. It hit the granite above the facility and dissipated, absorbed by the device's field with no apparent effect on the facility below. The vessel fired again, and again, escalating power with each pulse. The mountain above the facility was visibly crumbling, but 300 feet down, the 63 individuals and their device were untouched, protected. The original fleet in deep space, the massive moon-sized structures still 3 days from Earth, changed course, accelerating beyond the physics that human science said were possible, closing their estimated arrival from 72 hours to something their instruments could no longer calculate, because the calculation assumed constant velocity, and the incoming structures were no longer moving at constant velocity, they were moving at constant intent. Whatever was stored in those structures, whatever technology or force or population was being transported to complete the harvest of Earth, it was being mobilized ahead of schedule, because something had changed the equation. Inside the facility, the 63 felt the door moving, felt something on the other side responding. Something vast and ancient and fundamentally different from everything that had come through the Euphrates opening. Something that didn't move through physical space so much as inhabit the possibility of space. The inheritors were coming, not in ships, not in bodies, in a form of presence that human language didn't have adequate words to describe. The ancient text had called it the filling of a prepared place, as if the universe itself was a vessel, and what was being poured into it now was something that had been held apart from normal reality until the door was opened. The device pulsed once with a light that was felt rather than seen, and three things happened simultaneously. Every modified human on Earth stopped moving, stood perfectly still, and the engineered neural pathways began dissolving, not violently, like morning frost under sunlight, the biological programming simply releasing, giving back the consciousness it had borrowed. Every being from beneath the Euphrates, from the original four who had been bound for millennia to the hundreds who had emerged from ancient sites worldwide, collapsed to their knees, not in submission, in recognition, in the terrible acknowledgement of something they had hoped would never happen, that the door they thought was sealed forever had been opened from the inside by the very species they had dismissed as livestock, and the advance vessel above Earth went completely dark, not destroyed, not damaged, waiting, in the manner of something that suddenly finds itself uncertain about who has the advantage. The harvest had been running on schedule for 72 hours. In a single moment, the balance had shifted, but the deep fleet was still coming, and whatever they carried was still 3 days away. 3 days for the inheritors to arrive fully. 3 days for modified humans to recover their full consciousness and choose their role in what was coming. 3 days for the remnant to understand what the device had actually opened and what was flowing through it. 3 days that felt like a held breath, the pause between the lightning and the thunder, the moment before everything changes forever. And somewhere in the depths of the facility, one of the 63 opened their eyes, looked at the others still connected to the device, and said something that no one in the room had any context to understand, but that every one of them instinctively knew was true. They're not coming to fight, they're coming to finish what they started here 50,000 years ago. And what they started here 50,000 years ago wasn't a harvest. She paused, the device pulsing with that deep blue light behind her. It was a gestation. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for the meaning to settle. Humanity wasn't a crop, it was an egg. And whatever was growing inside it was what both the harvest civilization and the inheritors of light had been waiting for, fighting over, racing toward this moment to either claim or protect. Something that had never existed before in the universe. Something that was being born right now. Through 63 people standing in an underground facility in Romania. Through every human being on Earth who was about to make a choice about who they were and who they intended to become. Through the next 72 hours that would determine whether what emerged was something the harvest civilization could control, or something that had never been controlled by anything, ever, in the history of the universe. The biological cascade began in the facility and moved outward like a wave, not through the device, through the 63 individuals who had served as conduits, through their DNA, through a mechanism that human science had no framework to describe but that the ancient text had called the inheritance transfer. The inheritor sequence activating in those 63 individuals had sent a biological signal through a medium that wasn't electromagnetic, wasn't chemical, wasn't any known transmission vector. It traveled through something that connected all human DNA simultaneously. Something that the harvest civilization had observed but never fully understood despite millennia of study. The phenomenon that human spirituality had always intuited and human science had always dismissed. Collective consciousness, real, biological, measurable in its effects if not in its mechanism. A shared field that linked every human nervous system to every other human nervous system across distance, across time, across the engineered barriers that the DNA modifications had been designed to exploit. The 63 hadn't just opened a door to the inheritors. They had turned on a light inside every human being on Earth. The wave reached the modified humans first, since their neural pathways had already been altered to interface with collective signals. The engineered obedience pathways dissolved like sugar in warm water. But what replaced them wasn't simply a return to pre-modification baseline. Something new was forming. The modifications had inadvertently created neural infrastructure that human brains hadn't previously possessed. Infrastructure that the engineering had built for collective obedience but that was now, freed from the obedience programming, repurposing itself for something the harvest civilization had never intended. True collective cognition, not the hive mind submission of the engineered programming. Something more like an orchestra than an army. Individual consciousness remaining fully intact while simultaneously accessing a shared cognitive space where the combined processing power of millions of minds could work on problems that no individual mind could solve. The modified humans weren't returning to what they'd been. They were becoming what the inheritors had always intended humanity to eventually become. What the genetic sequence had been planted 12,000 years ago to eventually produce. What required the specific pressure of this exact crisis to activate. Humans were evolving in real time, consciously, by choice. Not the mechanical evolution of the harvest civilization's genetic manipulation. Not the slow drift of natural selection over millennia. Something unprecedented, directed conscious evolution. A species deciding, collectively, in a single moment, to become something greater than it had been. The harvest civilization's vessels detected the biological cascade immediately. Every instrument the visitors possessed began registering readings that their databases had no category for, because their databases contained records from 200 civilizations that had been harvested, 200 species that had been cultivated, collected, processed. None of them had ever done this. In 200 harvests across multiple star systems spanning hundreds of thousands of years, no cultivated species had ever reached this developmental threshold. The harvest timing had always succeeded in collecting the crop before the seed could germinate into something uncollectible. This was the first time the timing had failed. The first time the opposition had managed to keep a harvest species intact long enough to activate. The first time the egg had been ready to hatch. The beings from the Euphrates were the first to respond to this realization. The original four, the most ancient, the ones who had been bound for millennia because they were too powerful to run loose during the cultivation period, processed the cascade data and reached a conclusion that the visitors operating the smaller harvest craft hadn't yet understood. The harvest was over, not failed, completed, but not in the way the harvest civilization had planned. The crop had ripened into something that couldn't be harvested. Something that the harvest civilization's processing technology wasn't designed to handle. Something that, if collected and transported to the fleet structures, would fundamentally alter everything it came into contact with. The original four beings made a decision that surprised everyone observing, human, visitor, and inheritor alike. They surrendered, walked to the center of their respective cities, knelt on the ground, and broadcast on every frequency simultaneously a message in the harvest civilization's own language. Recall the fleet. The experiment has succeeded. The terms of the ancient agreement are met. The ancient agreement. A phrase that appeared nowhere in remnant research, nowhere in Vatican archives, nowhere in the leaked government documents. A phrase that the harvest civilization's own incoming fleet responded to by decelerating immediately, stopping in deep space, holding position, waiting for clarification on terms that apparently predated the harvest civilization's records of Earth, terms that had been set by something older than both the harvest civilization and the inheritors of light. Something that had apparently anticipated this exact moment and built contingencies into the situation that neither side in the ancient conflict had fully understood. The original four beings, still kneeling in their respective cities, began speaking again. This time not to the fleet, to the humans surrounding them. In perfect, unaccented English, we owe you an explanation, and an apology, and the truth about what you actually are. The streets were silent. The processing had stopped. The small harvest craft sat motionless on their platforms. The advance vessel remained dark in orbit, and every human being on Earth, modified and unmodified, felt the collective field that had awakened in them quiet to a listening stillness. You were never livestock, the being in Times Square said to a crowd of thousands while billions watched through every functional camera and screen on Earth. You were never a crop. You were never meant to be harvested. The being paused, its enormous form seeming somehow smaller than it had hours before, more tired, more ancient. You were a bet. The explanation took 3 hours. Delivered simultaneously by the four ancient beings in 4 cities, in every human language, patiently, completely, without the evasion or manipulation that had characterized every previous contact. The harvest civilization was ancient, genuinely ancient, predating Earth's formation by 1 billion years, a species that had evolved to a point where biological limitation had become their greatest frustration. They had conquered disease, aging, physical vulnerability, but they could not transcend the fundamental ceiling of their cognitive architecture. They were brilliant, but they were brilliant in the same way. Every individual in their species processed reality through the same cognitive framework that their biology had produced. Individually powerful but collectively redundant. Like a library full of identical books. They had discovered, through study of 1,000 species across the galaxy, that consciousness took radically different forms depending on the biological substrate it emerged from. And that some forms of consciousness, rare, unpredictable, almost impossible to engineer deliberately, could achieve cognitive states that their own minds simply couldn't access. States that solved problems their civilization had been working on for hundreds of thousands of years. They had tried direct genetic engineering of client species, produced capable beings but never the breakthrough they were seeking. The engineered species always converged toward the harvest civilization's own cognitive framework, as if being touched too directly by their technology contaminated the developmental process. The inheritors of light were the opposing faction within the harvest civilization's own history. Beings who had argued, for as long as the debate had existed, that the cultivation approach was both ethically wrong and practically flawed, that you couldn't grow something genuinely new in a controlled environment, that the very act of control prevented the emergence of what they were seeking. The inheritors had proposed an alternative: leave a species completely alone, Don't cultivate, don't guide, don't touch, simply observe. And if the species was capable of reaching the threshold on its own, you would know that what emerged was authentic, uncontaminated, genuinely novel. The harvest civilization had rejected the proposal as impractically slow, had continued their cultivation program across multiple star systems. Until Earth, the bet had been made 50,000 years ago between the harvest civilization's governing council and the inheritors' representatives. One species, one world. The harvest civilization would plant their genetic foundations as usual, but the inheritors would be allowed to run their non-intervention protocol simultaneously. If the cultivated species reached the activation threshold before harvest, the inheritors won the argument. The harvest civilization would cease cultivation operations across all active sites, permanently. If the harvest proceeded without activation, the harvest civilization would continue as before and the inheritors would withdraw their opposition permanently. Earth was the test case, the one world where both approaches ran simultaneously, where harvest civilization genetics met inheritor patience met the one variable that neither side had fully accounted for: human choice. Not engineered, not guided, not cultivated into compliance, but genuine, chaotic, wildly unpredictable human choice exercised across 50,000 years of uncontrolled development. The ancient being in Times Square paused in its explanation, looked at the crowd with eyes that were tired in a way that spanned geological time. We thought the timeline would never close. Your species was so consistently, magnificently self-destructive, so creative in finding new ways to prevent your own potential. Every time the conditions for activation began forming, something would happen: a war, a plague, a dark age that set the cognitive development back by centuries, a sound that might have been something like a laugh, or what a being makes when it has watched enough of human history to find the dark humor in it. We underestimated what you would do under maximum pressure, what you would become when everything was at stake, when the option of self-destruction was taken off the table and you had nothing left to do but be what you actually were. The being looked at the crowd, at the camera feeds, at every screen on Earth. You are the first species in the history of this galaxy to activate consciously, to choose evolution rather than having it done to you, to crack your own egg from the inside. Another pause. You have no idea what you are. The crowd in Times Square had no precedent for this moment. No cultural script for how to respond to an ancient being kneeling on a city street and telling you that your species had just won a bet that would change galactic civilization. Someone in the crowd laughed, nervously. Then someone else. Then the laughter spread in waves that weren't entirely about humor, that contained terror and awe and the specific hilarity of a situation so far beyond human scale that the only sane response was absurdity. The being watched the laughter spread and something in its expression shifted toward something that might have been recognition. Yes, it said quietly, that. Exactly that. That is what we could never produce in a controlled environment. The incoming fleet held position in deep space. The advance vessel remained dark. The harvest civilization's governing council was, for the first time in their recorded history, waiting for a decision to be made by someone else. Because the terms of the ancient agreement were clear. If the species activated, the next step wasn't determined by either the harvest civilization or the inheritors. It was determined by the activated species, by what humanity chose to do next. And in the collective field that now connected every human mind on Earth, in the shared cognitive space that had awakened through the device in Romania and through the 63 marked individuals and through 50,000 years of impossible stubborn human persistence, the question was being considered. Not by governments, not by militaries, not by any institution or authority, by everyone, simultaneously, together. For the first time in human history, the species was thinking as one organism while remaining completely individual. And the answer that was forming in that shared space was not the answer that anyone, human, harvest civilization, or inheritor, had predicted, because it was genuinely novel, because it had never existed before, because that was precisely the point. The collective deliberation lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, not in words, not in the linear argument and counterargument that human political and philosophical traditions had developed for individual minds working in sequence, in something more efficient and more strange. A simultaneous processing of perspective across 8 billion viewpoints that produced understanding at a rate no individual consciousness could achieve alone. It felt, to those experiencing it, like remembering something you'd always known but never had the cognitive capacity to fully retrieve. Like the answer to a question that had been present in the back of every human mind for as long as humans had asked questions. Who are we? What are we for? What is this for? The activated collective mind didn't produce a single unified answer the way a voted resolution would. It produced something more complex. A multidimensional response that contained what individuals would have called a decision but was more accurately described as a simultaneous recognition of what was true and what was therefore inevitable. 8 billion individual perspectives. 8 billion different life experiences. 8 billion different fears and hopes and values and ways of understanding reality. And a single shared conclusion that none of those 8 billion individuals would have reached alone but that every one of them, feeling it form in the collective space, recognized as authentic, as theirs. The four ancient beings received the decision simultaneously, transmitted through the collective field in a form their instruments could detect and translate. They were silent for a long time after receiving it. The being in Times Square finally spoke. "You understand what you're asking." Not a question, a confirmation that the implications had been fully processed. The collective field responded in a way that manifested physically. In Times Square and in the other 3 cities and in locations worldwide where humans had gathered in the hours since the harvest stopped. A sound rising from human throats that wasn't quite speech and wasn't quite music. The harmonic resonance that the remnant had discovered as a weapon against the beings, but arising now naturally, organically, from the same biological mechanism but expressing something entirely different. Not resistance. Invitation. The decision wasn't to expel the harvest civilization, wasn't to ally with the inheritors, wasn't to demand reparations or acknowledgement or justice for 50,000 years of cultivation and manipulation. The decision was to extend the bet. If the harvest civilization genuinely needed what humanity had developed, what emerged from 50,000 years of painful, self-destructive, magnificently flawed human experience, then humanity was willing to share it. Not through processing, not through collection, not through any mechanism of the harvest civilization's own design. Through contact, real contact, the kind that required the harvest civilization to do something they had not done in all their recorded history, to learn from the cultivated species, to allow themselves to be changed by the encounter rather than simply changing what they encountered. The ancient terms of the bet had specified that if the species activated, the next step was theirs to determine. Humanity had determined it. Come and learn, not as farmers to livestock, not as gods to worshippers, not as any relationship with a predetermined hierarchy. As equals encountering genuine difference for the first time, the ancient being in Times Square processed this, transmitted it to the advance vessel above, watched it relay to the deep fleet still holding position 3 days out, watched the fleet's configuration change, the massive geometric structures reorienting, not accelerating toward Earth, not retreating, moving into a pattern that the harvest civilization used for only one purpose in their long history, receiving transmissions, listening. "They're considering it," the being said. And then, with an expression that genuine age produces when it encounters genuine surprise, "They've never considered anything before. In their history, they decided. They executed. Consideration is." The being looked at the crowd, knew. The 72 hours that followed were quiet in a way that Earth had never been quiet. Not empty quiet, not the quiet of endings. The quiet of something vast catching its breath before beginning something unprecedented. The small harvest craft remained on their platforms but their functions changed. The biological processing equipment was reconfigured with visitor cooperation into medical technology. The DNA modifications that had been forced on the compliant nation populations were being evaluated for the elements that the collective mind identified as genuinely beneficial versus the elements that had been engineered for control. The beneficial elements, the enhanced neural connectivity, certain physical improvements, the capacity for collective cognition that had been crudely implemented but pointed towards something real, were being studied. Not to be reversed entirely, to be understood, and then to be consented to or rejected by each individual human based on full information and free choice. The 3 nations that had been punished, Brazil, Australia, Norway, reported the immediate cessation of the anomalous geological and meteorological activity. The 200,000 missing Norwegians reappeared in Oslo's streets over a 6-hour period, physically unharmed, but changed in ways they were still processing. They had been in the holding space between the inheritors' adjacent reality and normal space, a place where time moved differently, where they had experienced what those who came back called the long view. Centuries of human history experienced not as sequential events but as a single continuous unfolding, a perspective shift that left them permanently altered in ways that no medical examination could quantify but that everyone who spoke with them could immediately recognize. They had seen what humanity was, what it had always been becoming, and they weren't afraid of anything anymore, not in a reckless way, in the way of someone who has seen enough of the larger story to understand that their individual chapter matters precisely because of its brevity, its specificity, its irreplaceable particularity. The facility in Romania became the primary contact point. The 63 marked individuals remained in connection with the device, but the nature of that connection had shifted from acute activation to something more like ongoing translation. They served as interpreters between the collective human field and the inheritors whose mode of presence was still partially incomprehensible to fully embodied human consciousness. The inheritors were explaining things, slowly, at a pace calibrated to what human cognition could absorb without breaking. What they explained was large enough to require the rest of human history to fully process. The universe was older than human cosmology understood. The processes that had produced consciousness were more widespread than human science had calculated. And the emergence of what humanity had just demonstrated, genuine collective individual consciousness, had been the rarest of those processes. So rare that in the entire observed universe across all time that the inheritors had been present to observe, it had happened exactly twice before. Both times in circumstances that the inheritors described only as the beginning of something too large to see the end of from where we stand. Both times followed by changes to the observable universe that appeared, from inside normal space, as shifts in fundamental physical constants. As if reality itself reorganized slightly around the new presence. As if consciousness at this level of development didn't just exist inside the universe. It changed it, not deliberately, not willfully, simply by being what it was. By processing reality at sufficient depth and novelty that it created new patterns in the fabric of what existed. The universe, the inheritors suggested carefully, was not as static a place as human physics had modeled it to be, and what humanity had just become was not a small addition to what existed in it. The Harvest Civilization's fleet held its position. The governing council was in deliberation that had now lasted longer than any deliberation in their recorded history, because the question before them was not whether to accept humanity's invitation. The question was whether they were capable of accepting it, whether the cognitive flexibility required to genuinely learn from a species they had created and tended and prepared for processing was something their minds could achieve, whether they were capable of the change they were being invited into. It was, several observers noted, exactly the same question humanity had been asking itself for 50,000 years. And humanity had, in the end, proven capable. The bet had been about humanity's potential, but the decision humanity had made had turned the bet back around. Now it was about the Harvest Civilization's potential. Now it was their turn to surprise everyone. The Euphrates still flows, quieter than before, the water levels returning gradually, the exposed structure at its bottom being studied by a joint team of humans and visitors working in a collaboration that has no historical precedent and requires entirely new protocols developed on the fly by people who are making it up as they go. Which, it turns out, is humanity's greatest skill. The spiral formation on the river's surface is gone. The opening at the center of the hexagonal structure has been sealed. Not by the visitors, not by human engineers, by the inheritors. Gently, carefully, in the way you close a door that has served its purpose. The 4 anchor points deep in the bedrock show fracture marks that geologists are studying alongside Harvest Civilization archaeologists who are experiencing the novel sensation of learning something they didn't already know. The chains that held the 4 ancient beings are being documented, measured, translated. The writing that covered the stone walls is being compiled into what will eventually become the longest text in human history. A complete record of everything that was bound here and why and when and what was always meant to happen when the waters fell. Somewhere in deep space, the fleet is reorganizing, not retreating, restructuring, preparing for a different kind of approach. One that no one fully understands yet because it's never been done before. The 63 marked individuals in the Romanian facility take turns sleeping, maintaining contact with the device in shifts. Some of them have families they haven't seen in weeks. They make calls home that must be deeply strange to receive. Yes, I'm fine. No, I can't fully explain what I'm doing. It's hard to describe. I'm sort of holding a door open. The modified humans who chose to keep their enhanced neural connectivity are learning to live with expanded perception. Support groups have formed spontaneously in every major city. The meetings are reportedly unlike any support group that has ever existed because when 8 people with genuine collective cognition sit in a circle and try to work through their feelings, the emotional processing happens at a speed and depth that leaves participants changed in ways they struggle to articulate to anyone who wasn't there. It's like being understood, one participant wrote in a widely shared post. Actually understood, by other people who are also actually being understood. I didn't know that was possible before. I don't know how I lived without it. The beings from the Euphrates are still here, walking among humans, no longer disguised, no longer towering and terrifying, still 12 feet tall, which is still quite tall, but somehow less alarming when the beings in question are patiently answering questions from curious crowds and occasionally helping with traffic jams by simply picking up the obstructing vehicle and moving it to the side of the road. There are ongoing negotiations about the legal status of ancient beings who predate the concept of legal status by approximately 50,000 years. Theologians worldwide are in extended emergency conference. Philosophers are having the time of their lives. Scientists are furiously rewriting textbooks and have been for weeks and expect to continue for decades. And somewhere in all of it, in the noise and the wonder and the bewilderment and the occasional moment of someone in Oslo who was gone for 3 days coming home to an apartment where their cat is extremely annoyed about the food situation, humanity is doing what it has always done. Adapting, arguing, loving each other imperfectly, making art about it, making jokes about it, making meaning out of it, being stubbornly, brilliantly, impossibly itself, which was, it turns out, the point all along. The Euphrates still flows, and somewhere along its banks, a single symbol carved into ancient stone remains untranslated. The linguistic teams have attempted it for weeks. The Harvest Civilization's vast historical database has no record of it. The inheritors, when asked, respond in a way that translates roughly to a smile. That one, they say, you will have to figure out yourselves. When will we understand it? The researchers ask. When you're ready, the inheritors say. And if the last few weeks are any indication, a pause that contains what appears to be genuine fondness, you're going to surprise everyone. The river flows, the stars turn, and somewhere in the collective field that now connects every human mind on Earth, 8 billion individual voices are doing something that has never happened before in the history of the universe. They're wondering what comes next. Together, for the very first time,